The phone call came at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary moment that splits your life into before and after. I was standing in my cramped Philadelphia studio, coffee going cold in my hand, staring at the rejection email I'd received an hour earlier. Another position I wouldn't get. Another door closing. Then my phone rang with a Washington, D.C. area code. And a voice said words I never imagined hearing. "Ms. Thompson, this is Director Michael Stevens from the White House Personnel Office. We'd like to discuss your nomination for Deputy Director of the National Education Innovation Council." My mother's voice echoed in my memory, sharp as broken glass. "You'll never amount to anything, Rachel. Stop dreaming and be realistic." That morning, standing in the autumn light filtering through my window, I realized that sometimes the people who doubt you the loudest are preparing you for the moment when you prove them spectacularly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The air in my parents' living room had felt suffocating that day, thick with disappointment and unspoken judgments. I sat on the same floral couch where I'd done homework as a child, where I'd announced my acceptance to Temple University, where I'd shared every milestone that mattered. But this time was different. This time I was 32 years old, and I just told my family I was leaving my steady job as a high school guidance counselor to pursue a position in educational policy research. My father, Robert Thompson, sat in his recliner by the window, the afternoon light from Scranton's gray October sky casting shadows across his weathered face. He'd worked at the steel mill for 37 years before it closed, then drove trucks until his back gave out. He believed in tangible work, in paychecks you could count, in security you could hold. My mother, Patricia, stood by the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of concern and something colder. My older brother Daniel occupied the other end of the couch, already successful in his own right as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. He'd bought a house in the suburbs, married his college girlfriend, produced 2 grandchildren. He was everything our parents understood and celebrated. When I finished explaining my decision, the silence stretched thin and brittle. My mother spoke first, her voice carrying that particular tone of exasperation I'd heard my entire life. "Rachel, when are you going to stop chasing fantasies? You have a good job, benefits, pension. Why would you throw that away for some research position that probably pays half as much?" I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money, that Professor Harrison had recommended me specifically, that this was a chance to influence education policy at a state level, to actually make changes that could help thousands of students instead of just the few hundred I saw each year. My father shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Your mother's right. You've always had your head in the clouds, ever since you were little. Remember when you wanted to be an astronaut? Then a senator? Now this. You need to grow up and accept reality." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to soften the blow with his practiced sales voice. "Look sis, I get it. You want to feel like you're making a difference. But Mom and Dad have a point. You're not getting any younger. Shouldn't you be thinking about stability? Maybe meeting someone, settling down?" The implication hung in the air. At 32 and unmarried, focused on my career instead of family, I was already a disappointment. This new choice was just further evidence of my inability to make practical decisions. I felt my throat tighten, that familiar burning behind my eyes that I'd learned to suppress years ago. "This is my decision," I said quietly. "I'm not asking for permission. I just wanted to let you know." My mother's laugh was short and bitter. "Of course you're not asking. You never do. You just barrel ahead with whatever idea pops into your head. Consequences be damned. Just like when you insisted on that expensive university instead of community college. Just like when you turned down that assistant principal position because you wanted to work with students instead of administration. You sabotage yourself, Rachel, and then wonder why things don't work out." I stood up, gathering my coat and purse. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice level. "Professor Harrison believes in this work. He believes in me." Daniel shook his head. "Professor Harrison is 73 years old and living in the past. The world doesn't work the way he thinks it does anymore. You need to wake up." I walked to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Before I left, my mother delivered her final verdict. The words that would loop in my mind for months afterward. You'll never be anything more than a dreamer, Rachel. And dreamers end up alone and broke. We're trying to save you from yourself, but you're too stubborn to see it. I drove back to Philadelphia in silence, the 2-hour journey feeling both too long and too short. The industrial landscape of Scranton gave way to highways and eventually the city skyline. My studio apartment waited, small and cramped but mine. That night, I sat at my second-hand desk and pulled out the letter Professor Harrison had written on my behalf, his neat handwriting covering 2 pages of university letterhead. He'd called me brilliant, innovative, exactly the kind of mind that education policy desperately needed. I read it 3 times, trying to let his words drown out my mother's voice. Professor William Harrison had been my academic advisor at Temple University, but he'd become so much more than that. He was the first person who'd treated my ideas as valuable, who'd challenged me to think bigger, who'd seen potential in me that I hadn't seen in myself. When other professors dismissed educational theory as impractical, he'd shown me how research could translate into real change. When I doubted myself, he'd pushed me forward. After graduation, we'd stayed in touch. He'd retired from full-time teaching but remained active in educational circles, consulting, writing, connecting people who needed connecting. When the state policy research position opened up, he'd called me directly. Rachel, he'd said, his voice warm and certain. This is your moment. Take it. I took the position. The pay was indeed less than my guidance counselor's salary, but the work was everything Professor Harrison had promised. I analyzed data on student achievement gaps, developed recommendations for literacy programs, collaborated with educators across Pennsylvania. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was operating at the level I was meant for. My parents didn't ask about my work. When I called home, which became less and less frequent, the conversation stayed surface level. My mother would mention Daniel's latest promotion, his daughter's honor roll achievement, the new deck they were building. The subtext was always clear. Look what success actually looks like. 8 months into my research position, Professor Harrison died. A heart attack, sudden and unexpected. I got the call from his daughter while I was in a meeting, and I had to excuse myself, stumbling into the hallway as grief hit me like a physical blow. The funeral was small, held at a chapel near Temple's campus. His family was there, along with former colleagues and a scattered group of students whose lives he'd shaped. I sat in the back, crying quietly, feeling unmoored. He'd been my advocate, my mentor, the one person who'd consistently believed in my path. During the reception afterward, his daughter Ellen approached me. She was in her 40s, a lawyer in Center City, composed even in her grief. Rachel Thompson, she asked, and I nodded. Dad talked about you often. He was so proud of your work. She handed me a small key on a simple ring. This is to his office at Temple. Technically they've cleaned it out, but he kept a private file cabinet there. He told me if anything happened to him, you should have access to it. He said you'd know what to do with what you found. I took the key, confused but grateful. Thank you. He meant everything to me. Ellen smiled sadly. He knew. He told me once that you reminded him of himself at your age. Idealistic, brilliant, and surrounded by people who didn't understand either quality. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the key, about what Professor Harrison might have left behind. At 6 in the morning, I gave up on rest and drove to Temple's campus. The building where he'd kept his office was quiet, most faculty not yet arrived. I climbed to the 3rd floor, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell. His office door still bore his nameplate. I unlocked it with shaking hands. The room had been cleared of most personal items, but the bones remained. Bookshelves empty now. A desk surface bare. A filing cabinet in the corner, industrial gray and unremarkable. I tried the key Ellen had given me. Fit perfectly. Inside the cabinet were 3 drawers. The top one contained academic papers, published articles, notes on various education theories. The second held correspondence, letters from former students, colleagues, policymakers. The 3rd drawer was locked separately, a smaller lock built into the drawer itself. I almost gave up, thinking I didn't have the right key. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But then I noticed an envelope taped to the back of the 2nd drawer. Inside was another, tinier key, and a note in Professor Harrison's handwriting. Rachel, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I won't be there to see what comes next, but I know it will be extraordinary. The bottom drawer contains documentation of a project I've been developing for the last decade. It's called the National Education Innovation Framework, a comprehensive plan for reforming how we approach learning in America. I've shared pieces of it with various think tanks and policy groups, but the complete vision exists only in these files. I'm leaving it to you because you have the mind to understand it and the courage to fight for it. The framework belongs to you now. Build something with it. Make it real. And Rachel, when people doubt you, remember that doubt says more about their limitations than yours. I opened the third drawer with trembling hands. Inside were 3 thick binders, each meticulously organized and labeled. Policy proposals, research data, implementation strategies, letters of support from educators across the country, a complete, revolutionary blueprint for transforming American education, built on evidence-based practices and innovative thinking. I pulled out the first binder and started reading. By page 10 I was crying. By page 50 I understood what he'd given me. This wasn't just research. This was a legacy. I spent the entire day in that office, reading every page, understanding the scope of what Professor Harrison had created. The framework addressed everything from early childhood education to college readiness, from teacher training to administrative reform. It was brilliant, comprehensive, and practical. It was also something that would face massive resistance from entrenched interests. As afternoon light slanted through the office windows, I found a separate folder tucked into the back of the third binder. Inside was a letter addressed to someone named Director Catherine Walsh at the Department of Education, dated just 3 weeks before Professor Harrison's death. He'd never sent it. The letter outlined the framework and formally proposed himself as a consultant to help implement it at a federal level. But there was a handwritten note paperclipped to the draft. Too old. They need someone younger, sharper. Rachel. He'd been planning to recommend me. I sat back in his old desk chair, overwhelmed. This was bigger than anything I'd imagined. This wasn't just state-level policy research. This was a vision for national change. I carefully packed all the binders into my bag, locked the office, and drove home in a daze. That night, I spread everything across my apartment floor and read through it again, this time taking notes, understanding not just what the framework proposed but how it could actually be implemented. Over the next 3 months, I worked obsessively. I refined Professor Harrison's framework, updated research, added my own analysis. I presented portions of it at education conferences. I published articles in policy journals. I sent proposals to think tanks and advocacy groups. Slowly, carefully, I built momentum. Director Catherine Walsh, the woman Professor Harrison had planned to contact, reached out after reading one of my articles. We met for coffee in Washington, and I walked her through the framework. She listened, asked sharp questions, and at the end told me she'd be in touch. I didn't hear from her for 6 weeks. During that time, I went home to Scranton for Thanksgiving. It was a mistake. Daniel had just received another promotion. My parents couldn't stop praising him, talking about his success, his stability, his bright future. When someone finally asked about my work, I mentioned the framework, the conferences, the growing interest from policy circles. My mother's expression didn't change. That's nice, dear. Still just research though, right? Not a real position. I felt 12 years old again, showing them a report card full of A's and hearing that I should have gotten A+. It's important work, Mom. I'm sure it feels that way. The conversation moved on, back to Daniel, back to safe topics. I left early, claiming I had work to finish, which was true. On the drive back to Philadelphia, my phone rang. A DC number. Director Walsh. Rachel, I've shared your framework with several people in the department. There's real interest. How would you feel about coming down for a more formal presentation? My heart hammered. Of course. When? Next month. I'll send details. And Rachel, this is impressive work. Really impressive. I thanked her, hands shaking so badly I had to pull over after we hung up. The presentation in Washington happened on a frozen January morning. I wore my best suit, carried Professor Harrison's original binders along with my updated materials, and walked into a conference room where 15 high-level education officials waited. I was terrified. But the moment I started talking about the framework, the fear dissolved. This was what I'd been preparing for my entire career. The presentation lasted 2 hours. They asked questions. I answered. They challenged assumptions. I defended them with data. At the end, Director Walsh thanked me, told me they'd be in touch, and I flew back to Philadelphia with no idea what would happen next. Weeks passed. I heard nothing. I started to think it had been a courtesy meeting, nothing more. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late February, my phone rang. Director Michael Stevens, White House Personnel Office. Ms. Thompson, we'd like to discuss your nomination for Deputy Director of the National Education Innovation Council. The words didn't make sense at first. I asked him to repeat them. He did patiently, then explained. The administration was creating a new council focused on education reform. They'd reviewed my framework, my research, my presentations. They wanted me to help lead it. This would be a presidential appointment, he said. Subject to Senate confirmation, but we're confident you'll be approved. Are you interested? I looked around my tiny studio apartment, at the stacks of research papers, at Professor Harrison's photograph on my desk. Yes, I said. Yes, I'm very interested. The formal offer came 2 days later. My parents would see the announcement on the news before I had a chance to tell them myself. When I finally called, my mother answered. Rachel? We just saw. Is this real? It's real, Mom. A long pause. Then grudgingly. Well, I suppose congratulations are in order. Not pride. Not excitement. Just acknowledgement that perhaps, maybe, I'd stumbled into something respectable after all. Daniel called separately. Hey, that's actually pretty cool. White House, huh? Guess your professor's project paid off. Your professor's project. Not mine. Never mine. But I was used to it by now. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story. Local woman tapped for White House education post. Jennifer Martinez, a colleague from my research position, called immediately. Rachel, this is incredible. Tell me everything. Jennifer had been one of the few people who'd understood what I was trying to build, who'd encouraged me when the work felt impossible. It doesn't feel real yet, I admitted. It's real. And you deserve it. That framework is groundbreaking. The formal announcement happened on a Thursday afternoon in March, and it changed everything in ways I hadn't anticipated. The White House released a press statement listing all the new appointees to various councils and advisory boards, and my name appeared third on the list. Rachel Thompson, Deputy Director of the National Education Innovation Council, formerly of the Pennsylvania Education Policy Research Institute. My phone exploded with messages. Former colleagues, old professors, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all reaching out with congratulations. The local news in Scranton picked up the story. A reporter called asking for a statement, wanting to know how it felt to go from a small industrial town to the White House. I gave them something generic and polite, but what I really wanted to say was that it felt like vindication, like every doubt I'd swallowed and every dismissal I'd endured had suddenly been exposed as wrong. My parents' reaction came not through a phone call but through my brother. Daniel texted me that evening asking if I was free to talk. When I called him back, his voice carried a strange mixture of congratulation and concern. Mom and Dad saw the news. They're kind of in shock. I waited, knowing there was more. They're happy for you, obviously. But Mom's worried about what this means. You know how she is. She's already thinking about all the ways it could go wrong. Of course she was. Even in a moment of achievement, my mother could find the shadow of potential failure. What did she actually say, Daniel? He hesitated. She said it's a big responsibility, that these political appointments don't always last, that you shouldn't get too comfortable because administrations change. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight settle on my chest. Right. Well, thanks for letting me know. Rachel, come on. She's just being practical. You know how uncertain government work can be. She's being herself, I said quietly. And I need to go. I have a briefing document to review. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the official letter from the White House Personnel Office. It outlined my responsibilities, my start date in May, the security clearance process I'd need to undergo. Everything was real, documented, official. But my mother's voice still managed to seep in, planting seeds of doubt where there should have been only celebration. Jennifer came over that night with a bottle of wine and Thai food. She'd been my closest friend since we'd started working together 3 years ago. One of those people who understood ambition without jealousy, who celebrated your wins as if they were her own. "Okay, I need to hear everything," she said, settling onto my couch. "How did this actually happen? Walk me through it." I told her about the presentation in Washington, about Director Walsh's follow-up calls, about the sudden phone call from the White House personnel office. They said they'd been tracking my work for months. Apparently, the framework got passed around to more people than I realized. When they decided to create this council, my name kept coming up. Jennifer raised her glass. "Because you're brilliant and you've been doing groundbreaking work. This isn't luck, Rachel. This is earned." "My mom doesn't see it that way." "Your mom wouldn't see it that way if you got appointed to the Supreme Court. She's determined to believe you're always one step away from disaster." It was true, and hearing it said out loud by someone else made it easier to accept. We spent the evening going through everything I'd need to do before the move to Washington. Finding an apartment, arranging the transition from my current position, preparing for the Senate confirmation hearings. "Are you nervous about the confirmation?" Jennifer asked. "Terrified. What if they find some reason to reject me?" "They won't. You're qualified, you have no skeletons, and your work speaks for itself. This is going to happen, Rachel. You need to start believing it." I wanted to. I wanted to feel the pure joy of this moment without the undercurrent of anxiety my family had instilled in me. But years of conditioning don't dissolve overnight. Still, sitting there with Jennifer, talking about the future instead of dwelling on the past, I felt something shift. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I was already doing it. The next morning, I drove to Laurel Hill Cemetery on the edge of Philadelphia. Professor Harrison was buried there, in a section overlooking the Schuylkill River. I'd been once before, right after the funeral, but I hadn't been back since. Now, with everything that had happened, I needed to tell him. The March morning was cold and bright, the kind of sharp clarity that makes everything feel more real. I found his grave easily, a simple granite marker with his name and dates and a single line beneath. "He taught others to think." I knelt in the grass, not caring that it was damp, and placed my hand on the stone. "I got it," I said quietly. "The appointment. They want me to implement the framework at a national level. It's actually happening." The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice. "Of course it's happening. I told you it would. I wish you were here to see it. I wish I could tell you everything, ask your advice, hear you say you're proud." But he wasn't here, and I was going to have to do this without him. The framework was mine now, the responsibility and the opportunity both. I stayed there for a long time, talking to him the way I used to in his office, working through my thoughts out loud. When I finally left, I felt steadier, more certain. Whatever happened next, I was ready for it. The Senate confirmation process began in April. I had to fill out endless paperwork, detailing every aspect of my life, my finances, my work history, my publications. An FBI agent came to my apartment to conduct a background check interview, asking questions about foreign contacts, financial obligations, any potential conflicts of interest. It was invasive and exhausting, but I understood the necessity. This was the price of public service at this level. My hearing was scheduled for late April, and I spent weeks preparing with a team from the White House counsel's office. They drilled me on potential questions, on how to handle hostile senators, on staying calm under pressure. "You're going to be fine," the lead counsel told me. "Your record is spotless, your qualifications are strong, and education reform has bipartisan support. This should be straightforward." Should be. Those words did little to calm my nerves. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept rehearsing answers, imagining worst-case scenarios, worrying about every possible thing that could go wrong. At 3 a.m, I finally gave up and made coffee, sitting at my desk reviewing my notes one more time. My phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "You're going to kill it tomorrow. Get some sleep. You've got this." I smiled despite my anxiety. Having someone in your corner, someone who believed in you unconditionally, made all the difference. I managed a few hours of sleep and woke to my alarm at 6. The hearing was at 10, which gave me time to shower, dress in my most professional suit, and review my opening statement one final time. I'd written it myself, refusing the White House team's offer to draft it for me. This needed to be in my own words. Jennifer met me for breakfast at a diner near Union Station. She'd taken the train down from Philadelphia just to be there. "You didn't have to come all this way," I said, though I was grateful she had. "Are you kidding? I'm not missing this. Besides, someone needs to be here to celebrate with you afterward." We ate eggs and toast, and she kept the conversation light, distracting me from my nerves. When it was time to go, she hugged me tight. "Remember who you are. Remember what you've accomplished. They should be honored to confirm you." I walked into the Senate office building feeling like I was moving through a dream. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, arranged with the senators' seats elevated at the front and a single table facing them where I would sit. A few people were already there, mostly staff and a handful of observers. No family. I hadn't told my parents the exact date, a small act of self-protection. If this went badly, I didn't want them to witness it. The hearing began promptly at 10. Senator Patricia Caldwell, the committee chair, called the room to order and introduced me. She gave a brief overview of my qualifications and the position I was nominated for, then invited me to make my opening statement. I took a breath and began. "Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today. Education has been my life's work, not because I come from a family of educators or because I had some grand plan from childhood, but because I experienced firsthand the power of a teacher who believes in a student's potential even when that student doesn't believe in themselves." I talked about Professor Harrison, about how his mentorship had shaped my understanding of what education could be. I talked about the framework, about the research behind it, about why reform was so desperately needed. I talked about my vision for the council and what I hoped to accomplish. When I finished, Senator Caldwell thanked me and opened the floor for questions. The first few were softballs, friendly inquiries about specific aspects of the framework, about my research methodology, about how I plan to work with state education departments. I answered clearly and confidently, falling into the rhythm of it. Then Senator Marcus Webb, a Republican from Texas known for his skepticism of federal education initiatives, leaned forward. "Ms. Thompson, I've reviewed your framework, and while I appreciate the research, I'm concerned about the cost. Your proposals would require significant federal investment. In a time of budget constraints, how do you justify asking taxpayers to fund what amounts to an experimental approach?" I'd prepared for this. "Senator, I appreciate your concern about costs, and you're right that implementing these reforms would require investment. However, the research shows that every dollar spent on early intervention and evidence-based educational practices saves approximately $7 in long-term social costs. We're not talking about experimental approaches. We're talking about scaling proven methods that are already working in pockets across the country. The question isn't whether we can afford to do this. It's whether we can afford not to." He nodded slowly. "That's a nice answer, Ms. Thompson. But nice answers don't balance budgets. Can you give me specific numbers? What would year one implementation actually cost?" I pulled out my prepared materials. For Phase 1 implementation, focusing on early literacy programs in underperforming districts, we're looking at approximately $300 million. That's less than 0.01% of the federal education budget. The projected outcome based on pilot programs is a 15% improvement in third-grade reading proficiency within 3 years, which correlates directly with high school graduation rates and lifetime earning potential. Senator Webb wrote something down. "And if it doesn't work? If we spend that money and don't see results? Then we adjust. That's why the framework includes built-in assessment metrics and flexibility. This isn't a one-size-fits-all mandate. It's a structure for evidence-based decision-making at every level." The questioning continued for another hour. Some senators were supportive, asking about implementation timelines and how they could help. Others were more challenging, probing for weaknesses or expressing concern about federal overreach. Through it all, I stayed calm, answered honestly, and refused to be rattled. When Senator Caldwell finally called for a vote, my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The vote was 14-3 in favor of confirmation. I'd passed. Senator Caldwell smiled. "Congratulations, Ms. Thompson. Welcome to public service. I thanked them, gathered my materials, and walked out of the hearing room in a daze. Jennifer was waiting in the hallway, and when she saw my face, she knew. "You got it." "I got it." She hugged me, and for the first time since this whole process began, I let myself fully feel the magnitude of what had just happened. I was going to work in the White House. I was going to implement the framework. I was going to do work that mattered on a scale I'd only dreamed about. We went to lunch to celebrate, finding a quiet restaurant where we could decompress. "How do you feel?" Jennifer asked. "Honestly, I feel like I'm waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake, like this is all going to evaporate. That's the imposter syndrome talking. You earned this, Rachel. Every bit of it." I knew she was right intellectually, but emotionally I still carried the weight of every dismissal, every doubt, every time I'd been told I was reaching too high. That evening I finally called my parents. My mother answered on the third ring. "Rachel, we saw the news. You were confirmed." I was. 14-3. "Well, that's good." A pause. "Your father wants to talk to you." My father's voice came on the line, gruff and uncomfortable. "Your mother says congratulations are in order." "Thanks, Dad. It's a big job. You sure you're ready for it?" There it was. Even now, even after everything, the doubt. "I'm ready." "All right then. Don't forget where you came from." I promised I wouldn't and ended the call as quickly as I could. Daniel texted later that night. "Congrats on the confirmation. Mom and Dad are proud even if they're weird about showing it." I didn't respond. I was tired of making excuses for them, tired of translating their criticism into some hidden form of love. If they were proud, they could say so. If they couldn't, that was their limitation, not mine. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I gave notice at my research position, packed up my apartment, and moved to Washington in early May. The White House had helped me find a small place in Foggy Bottom, close enough to walk to work. It was tiny but felt like a palace compared to my Philadelphia studio. My official start date was May 15th, and I spent the days leading up to it reading briefing books, meeting with staff, and learning the Byzantine processes of federal bureaucracy. On my first day, I walked into the Eisenhower Executive Office building, feeling like an imposter in a borrowed suit. My office was on the third floor, a modest space with a desk, a bookshelf, and a window overlooking the street. There was a nameplate on the door. Rachel Thompson, Deputy Director, National Education Innovation Council. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, trying to internalize that this was real, that I belonged here. My assistant, a efficient woman named Claire who'd worked in the education department for 15 years, appeared with a stack of folders. "Welcome, Ms. Thompson. These are the priority items for your first week. Director Walsh wants to meet with you at 2 this afternoon, and you have a staff meeting tomorrow morning at 9. I took the folders, feeling the weight of them literally and figuratively. "Thank you, Claire. I appreciate your help getting oriented." She smiled. "We're glad to have you. The team has been excited about the framework since they first saw it. There's real momentum for change here." Momentum for change. That's what Professor Harrison had always talked about, the accumulation of small shifts that eventually became transformation. I spent my first day reading through briefing materials, learning about ongoing initiatives, understanding where the framework would fit into existing structures. By the time I left that evening, my head was spinning with information, but I also felt energized. This was work that mattered. This was exactly where I was supposed to be. The meeting with Director Walsh the next afternoon was equally encouraging. She was in her late 50s, sharp and direct, with a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. "Rachel, I'm not going to pretend this will be easy. You're going to face resistance from entrenched interests, from people who profit from the current system staying exactly as it is. But you have support here, and more importantly, you have a plan that actually works. I've read your research. I've seen the pilot results. This is the real thing." "Thank you, Director. I know there will be challenges, but I'm ready for them." "Good. Because they're coming sooner than you think." She wasn't exaggerating. Within 2 weeks of starting, I received my first major opposition. A coalition of textbook publishers, concerned that the framework's emphasis on open-source educational resources would cut into their profits, launched a lobbying effort against it. They sent representatives to meet with key senators, arguing that the framework was untested and would harm students by providing inferior materials. It was completely false, but it was also effective. 3 senators who'd voted for my confirmation sent letters expressing concerns about moving too quickly on implementation. I spent a long evening in my office drafting a response, detailing the research behind open-source materials, showing how schools using them had actually improved student outcomes while reducing costs. Jennifer called while I was working. I saw the news about the textbook companies. You okay? Frustrated. Everything I put in the framework was backed by research, and they're fighting it because it threatens their bottom line. Welcome to Washington. But you're not backing down, right? Not even a little bit. That's my girl. Go get them. I sent the response memo to Director Walsh, who forwarded it to the relevant senators. 2 of the 3 backed off immediately. The third, who had significant campaign contributions from the publishing industry, remained opposed. It was my first real lesson in how politics and policy intersected, and how money often spoke louder than evidence. But I'd known this work wouldn't be easy. Professor Harrison had warned me, had told me that real change always faced resistance because it threatened people who benefited from the status quo. The key was to stay focused on the mission, to keep building support, to let the results speak for themselves. By the end of my first month, we'd launched the pilot program for early literacy intervention in 5 underperforming districts across the country. The framework was moving from theory to practice, and I was right in the middle of it, working 18-hour days fueled by coffee and purpose. My parents still hadn't visited. My mother called occasionally, always with some note of concern. Was I eating enough? Did I have time for a social life? Wasn't I working too hard? The subtext was always the same. This couldn't possibly last. I was setting myself up for burnout or failure or both. Daniel visited once, coming down for a conference. We met for dinner, and he spent most of the meal talking about his own work, his latest promotion, the house renovations he was planning. When I tried to talk about the framework, he nodded politely but clearly wasn't interested. It all sounds very complicated, he said. I'm sure it's important. The dismissal was casual but complete. In his world and in our parents' world, real success looked like what he had. A house in the suburbs, a corporate job, a conventional life. What I was doing was too abstract, too idealistic, too uncertain to count. I stopped trying to explain after that. The people who mattered understood. Director Walsh understood. My team understood. Jennifer understood. And somewhere, I believe Professor Harrison would have understood too. That was enough. As summer arrived, bringing heat and humidity to Washington, I settled into the rhythm of my work. The pilot programs were showing early promising results. We were building relationships with state education departments, with school districts, with teachers on the ground. The framework was becoming real, one implementation at a time. And I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The summer heat in Washington was relentless, the kind that made the air shimmer above the pavement and turned every walk outside into an ordeal. I'd been in my position for 3 months, and the initial excitement had settled into the steady grind of implementation work. The pilot programs were running, data was being collected, and I was spending most of my days in meetings, on calls with district administrators, and reviewing progress reports. It was exhausting but fulfilling, the kind of tired that came from meaningful work rather than empty busy work. Then the first round of data came back and everything shifted. The early literacy intervention program we'd launched in 5 districts wasn't showing the improvements we'd projected. 2 districts showed modest gains, barely above statistical noise. 2 showed no change at all. And 1, a district in rural Ohio, actually showed a slight decline in reading proficiency scores. I sat in my office staring at the numbers, feeling my stomach drop. This couldn't be right. The research was solid. The pilot programs we based this on had worked. What had gone wrong? Claire knocked on my door frame, her expression sympathetic. Director Walsh wants to see you at 3. She's seen the preliminary data. Of course she had. Everyone had probably seen it by now. I gathered the reports and walked down the hall to her office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Director Walsh was on a call when I arrived, but she waved me in and pointed to a chair. I sat, clutching the folder, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. She ended her call and turned to me, her expression unreadable. Walk me through what you think happened, she said, not unkindly. I took a breath and opened the folder. I've been reviewing the implementation reports from each district. The two that showed modest gains followed the framework closely, provided the recommended training for teachers, and maintained consistent communication with our team. The two that showed no change had implementation problems. One didn't complete the full teacher training program. The other didn't have buy-in from building principals, so the methods weren't being used consistently. And the Ohio district that went backward? That one's more complicated. They implemented everything correctly on paper, but when I looked deeper into the reports, the district was simultaneously dealing with a budget crisis. They'd cut paraprofessional positions right as we launched, which meant teachers were overwhelmed and couldn't give the intervention program the attention it needed. The decline probably has more to do with those cuts than with our methods. Director Walsh nodded slowly. That's good analysis. But you know what the opponents are going to say. They're going to point to these numbers and claim the framework doesn't work, that we're wasting money on unproven methods. I know. But 3 months isn't enough time to draw real conclusions. We need at least a full school year, preferably 2, to see meaningful results. Educational change is slow. You're right. But politics is fast. I got 3 calls this morning from congressional offices asking about these numbers. The textbook lobby is already circulating the Ohio data as proof that the framework is failing. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. That's dishonest. They're cherry-picking one data point and ignoring all context. Of course it is. But it's also effective. We need to get ahead of this. I want you to prepare a detailed response, something we can share with congressional offices and the media. Show the full picture, explain the implementation challenges, and give a realistic timeline for when we'll have more conclusive data. I spent the rest of that afternoon and most of the evening drafting the response. I pulled in implementation reports, interviews with teachers, contextual information about each district's unique challenges. I showed how the 2 districts with proper implementation were on track, how the issues in the other districts were correctable, and why rushing to judgment based on preliminary data was both premature and irresponsible. When I finally sent it to Director Walsh at 11 that night, I was exhausted and frustrated. This was the part of the work Professor Harrison had warned me about. The actual education part was straightforward. It was the politics, the manipulation of data, the bad faith arguments from people who cared more about profits than children, that made everything harder. The next morning, I woke to multiple missed calls from Jennifer. When I called her back, she sounded worried. Have you seen the news? No, what happened? The Washington Post ran a story. Quote, White House Education Initiative shows early struggles. They focused almost entirely on the Ohio numbers. I pulled up the article on my phone, my heart sinking as I read. The headline was bad enough, but the content was worse. They'd quoted an unnamed source saying the framework was overly ambitious and poorly planned. They'd included a statement from the Textbook Publishers Coalition expressing concern about rushing untested methods into classrooms. And buried in the 7th paragraph, almost as an afterthought, was a single sentence mentioning that implementation challenges might have played a role. This is a hit piece, I said. Someone fed them the Ohio data and a narrative, and they ran with it without doing real reporting. Can you push back? Issue a statement? Director Walsh and I prepared a response yesterday. I'll make sure it gets to the Post and every other outlet covering this. But damage control felt different from actual control. The narrative was out there now, and narratives had momentum. I spent the day doing interviews, talking to education reporters, trying to provide context and nuance. Some listened. Others had already decided on their angle and weren't interested in complicating it with facts. By the end of the week, the story had spread. Conservative outlets picked it up as evidence of government overreach and wasted spending. Liberal outlets were more sympathetic but still questioning whether the framework had been rolled out too quickly. My inbox filled with messages from district administrators asking if the program was going to be pulled, from teachers wondering if they should continue implementation, from supporters concerned that the whole initiative was in jeopardy. I held a conference call with all 5 pilot districts, reassuring them that we were committed to the full program, that early data was always messy, that we believed in what we were building together. Most seemed relieved, but I could hear the doubt creeping in. If the national conversation was about failure, It became harder for people on the ground to maintain faith in success. That weekend, I stayed in my apartment, too drained to do much of anything. Jennifer called Saturday afternoon. "You need to get out of your head. Come back to Philly for the night. We'll get dinner, decompress, remind you that the world is bigger than one news cycle." "I can't. I have too much work." "Rachel, you're running on empty. One night away isn't going to derail anything. It might actually help you think more clearly." She was probably right. I took the train up Saturday evening, and we went to our favorite Thai place, the one we'd celebrated at after my appointment was announced. It felt like a lifetime ago instead of just 4 months. "Okay, real talk," Jennifer said over pad thai. "How bad is this actually?" "Bad enough to make the work harder. Not bad enough to kill it entirely. If we can make it through this school year and show real results, we'll be fine. But if we have another setback, or if the opposition manages to cut funding, it could all fall apart." "What do you need?" "Time. And for people to stop treating 3 months of data like it's the final word on a decade-long reform effort. That's the problem with doing innovative work. Everyone wants instant results. They want you to revolutionize education by Tuesday." I smiled despite my exhaustion. "Yeah, that would be convenient." We spent the rest of the evening not talking about work, just being friends. It was exactly what I needed, a reminder that I was more than my job, more than this one project, even if it didn't always feel that way. On the train back to Washington Sunday afternoon, I felt steadier, more capable of facing whatever came next. What came next was my mother calling. I saw her name on my phone and considered not answering, but guilt won out. "Hi, Mom. Rachel, your father and I saw the news about your program. Are you all right?" The concern in her voice was real, but so was something else. Something that sounded like vindication. "I'm fine. The news stories were overblown. We're still on track." "Are you sure?" They made it sound quite serious. Like perhaps things were moving too quickly. There it was. "Mom, this is how implementation works. There are always challenges in the beginning. We anticipated that. I just worry that you've taken on more than you can handle. This is such a high-profile position. If things don't work out, it could damage your career." My jaw tightened. Things are working out. We're 3 months into a multi-year initiative. Judging it now is like judging a construction project when you've only poured the foundation. You don't need to get defensive. I'm your mother. I'm allowed to worry. "You're not worried, Mom. You're waiting for me to fail so you can say you were right all along." Silence on the other end of the line. Then her voice cold. "That's an awful thing to say. But is it wrong?" More silence. "Then I have to go. Your father needs help with something." She hung up. I sat staring at my phone, anger and hurt mixing together in my chest. Why had I answered? Why did I keep hoping for something different from her? The fall semester began, and with it came more data. This time the numbers were better. 4 of the 5 districts showed measurable improvement in early literacy benchmarks. The Ohio district was still struggling, but we'd worked with them to address the resource issues, and teachers were reporting more confidence in the methods. It wasn't a dramatic turnaround, but it was real progress, the kind that could be sustained and built upon. I compiled everything into a report and presented it at a staff meeting. Director Walsh reviewed the data carefully. "This is good. Not perfect, but good. We can work with this. Should we do a press release? Try to counter the earlier negative coverage?" She considered. "Not yet. Let's wait until we have end-of-semester data. That'll be more substantial. For now, let's focus on supporting the districts and making sure implementation stays strong." It was the right strategic decision, but it meant living with the negative narrative a while longer. The textbook lobby continued their campaign, placing up EDS in major papers arguing that the framework was a failed experiment. Conservative think tanks released reports questioning the cost-effectiveness. My name appeared in articles, usually attached to phrases like embattled deputy director or controversial initiative. I tried not to read the comments sections, but sometimes I couldn't help myself. The internet had opinions about me, about my qualifications, about whether I was naive or incompetent or both. It was brutal and personal in a way I hadn't experienced before. One particularly vicious editorial appeared in a conservative outlet, written by someone named Marcus Webb. It took me a moment to place the name, Then I remembered. Senator Webb, who'd questioned me during my confirmation hearing. Apparently, he'd decided I was a useful target. The piece accused me of pushing a radical agenda, of wasting taxpayer money, of being more interested in academic theories than practical results. I read it twice, feeling angrier each time. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drafted a response and sent it to the publication. They didn't print it. Instead, 2 days later, another piece appeared. This one suggesting that my defensive reaction proved I couldn't handle criticism. I'd been baited and had fallen for it completely. Director Walsh called me into her office. I saw the web pieces. I shouldn't have responded. I know that now. No, you shouldn't have. But I understand why you did. This work is personal for you. When someone attacks it, it feels like they're attacking you. It is me. The framework, this initiative, it's everything I've worked toward for years. I know. But you need to develop thicker skin. This is only going to get worse as we get closer to real implementation. The people who benefit from the current system aren't going to give up without a fight, and they're very good at making it personal. She was right and I knew it. But knowing something intellectually and being able to execute it emotionally were two different things. October brought cooler weather and a shift in focus. We were planning the expansion of the pilot program, identifying additional districts for the next phase. I was traveling constantly, visiting schools, meeting with administrators and teachers, seeing the framework in action. Those visits kept me grounded. When I was in classrooms, watching teachers use the methods we developed, seeing students engage with learning in new ways, all the political noise faded into background static. This was real. This mattered. Everything else was just obstacles to work around. In a second-grade classroom in Maryland, I watched a teacher use one of our literacy interventions with a struggling reader. The child, a girl with bright pink glasses and a shy smile, slowly worked her way through a passage, using the decoding strategies we'd taught. When she finished, successfully reading something that had been impossible for her a month earlier, her face lit up with pride and surprise. The teacher caught my eye and smiled. This was why we did the work. But back in Washington, the obstacles kept multiplying. Budget negotiations were starting for the next fiscal year, and several senators were proposing cuts to education initiatives, specifically targeting new programs that hadn't yet proven their worth. Our program was explicitly mentioned. I spent days on Capitol Hill, meeting with staffers, making the case for continued funding, showing our data, explaining why cutting support now would waste all the investment we'd already made. Some listened. Others had already made up their minds. The hearing with the Appropriations Subcommittee was scheduled for early November. I prepared testimony, refined our data presentation, and tried to anticipate every possible question or attack. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that second grader in Maryland, about all the students like her who would benefit if we could just get people to look past politics and see the actual impact. The hearing room was packed, mostly with lobbyists and advocacy groups on both sides of the issue. I sat at the witness table, my written testimony in front of me, and waited for the senators to arrive. When they filed in, Senator Webb was among them. Of course he was. He'd made opposition to the framework part of his brand. The chair, Senator Linda Morrison from Oregon, called the hearing to order and invited me to present my opening statement. I spoke for 10 minutes, outlining our progress, acknowledging the challenges, and making the case for why continued funding was essential. When I finished, Senator Morrison thanked me and opened the floor for questions. The first few were supportive, from senators who represented states where our pilot programs were showing success. They asked about expansion plans, about how their states could participate, about what additional resources we needed. I answered confidently, feeling the rhythm of it, the same way I had during my confirmation hearing. Then Senator Webb leaned into his microphone. Ms. Thompson, I've reviewed your data, and I remain unconvinced. You've spent millions of dollars to achieve what you call modest improvements. How is that a good return on investment? I'd prepared for this. Senator, the improvements we're seeing in early literacy are actually quite significant when you understand the baseline. Students who were reading at levels 2 years behind grade level are now reading at levels only 1 year behind. That's tremendous progress in just a few months, and it compounds over time. A student who learns to read proficiently by 3rd grade is 4 times more likely to graduate high school. We're not just improving test scores. We're changing life trajectories. That's a nice story, but stories don't justify budgets. Can you give me hard numbers on cost per student improvement? I pulled out my detailed breakdown. The cost per student in the pilot districts is approximately $1,200 annually. The projected lifetime earnings increase for a student who graduates high school versus one who drops out is approximately $400,000. Even if we only prevent a fraction of students from dropping out, the return on investment is substantial. Projected earnings. Estimates. Might prevent. These are all hypotheticals, Ms. Thompson. What I see are actual dollars being spent on uncertain outcomes. All education spending is an investment in uncertain outcomes, Senator. We can't guarantee that any individual student will succeed. What we can do is provide evidence-based interventions that dramatically increase the probability of success. That's what the framework does. Senator Webb sat back, clearly unsatisfied but not having another immediate angle of attack. The questions continued, back and forth between support and skepticism. I answered each one as honestly as I could, refusing to oversell our results but also refusing to downplay their significance. When the hearing finally ended 2 hours later, I felt wrung out and uncertain. Had I done enough? Would the funding survive? Senator Morrison approached me afterward as I was gathering my materials. You did well in there. Webb's always going to be a problem, but the moderates are with you. I think you'll get your funding. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate your support. Just keep showing results. That's the best defense against critics. I walked out of the Capitol building into a gray November afternoon. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Watched the hearing online. You were brilliant. Webb looked like an idiot. I smiled. Maybe it had gone better than I thought. Back at my office, Claire informed me that I'd gotten multiple interview requests from education publications wanting to discuss the hearing. I agreed to a few carefully chosen outlets that would give me space to explain nuance rather than just looking for controversy. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, follow-up meetings, and continued work with the pilot districts. Thanksgiving approached, and I dreaded the inevitable question of whether I'd go home to Scranton. Jennifer invited me to spend it with her family in Philadelphia instead. My parents would love to have you. We always do Thanksgiving big, lots of food, very low stress. No one will interrogate you about your career choices. It was tempting, but I knew I should see my own family. It had been months, and despite everything, they were still my parents. I drove to Scranton on Thanksgiving morning, the highways mostly empty, the sky a flat gray that matched my mood. My parents' house looked the same as always, the front porch decorated with my mother's fall wreath, my father's truck in the driveway. Daniel's car was there too, along with his wife Amanda's SUV. The whole family gathered. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. Inside, the house smelled like turkey and pie. My mother was in the kitchen, my father in his recliner watching football. Daniel and Amanda were on the couch with their kids, who were playing a video game on tablets. Rachel. Amanda stood to hug me. It's so good to see you. The kids were asking about their aunt who works at the White House. I hugged her back, grateful for her warmth. Amanda had always been kind to me, more accepting than my own family. Hi everyone. Sorry I'm late. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. You're not late. Dinner's not for another hour. Come help me with the vegetables. I followed her into the kitchen, knowing this was when the real conversation would happen. She handed me a peeler and a bag of potatoes without preamble. We worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scrape of peelers and the distant television. Then, inevitably, she spoke. So, how is the job really going? It's going well. We're making progress. That's not what the news says. The news focuses on controversy. The actual work is more complicated. Your father and I worry, Rachel. This seems like so much stress for you. You look thin. I set down the peeler, forcing myself to stay calm. Mom, I'm fine. I'm doing work I care about. Yes, it's stressful, but it's also meaningful. But for how long? These political appointments don't last. What happens when the administration changes? Will you be out of work? Then I'll find other work. I have experience now, connections, a track record. I'll be fine. She shook her head. You're so confident. You've always been so confident, even when you're wrong. The words stung precisely because she said them so casually, as if it was obvious fact rather than cutting criticism. What am I wrong about, Mom? This whole path. You could have stayed in Philadelphia, kept your stable job, built a normal life. Instead, you're chasing this big career in Washington, and for what? To prove something? To make a difference. Everyone thinks they're going to make a difference. Most people just end up disappointed. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to make her understand. But standing in that kitchen, peeling potatoes while my mother casually dismantled my life choices, I realized something fundamental. She was never going to understand. She was never going to celebrate my achievements or believe in my path. And spending energy trying to convince her was only draining me of the strength I needed for the actual work. I picked up the peeler again and finished the potatoes in silence. Dinner was the uncomfortable affair I'd expected. Daniel dominated the conversation, talking about his latest sales numbers, the vacation he and Amanda were planning to Aruba, the new car he was considering. My parents hung on every word, asking questions, offering advice, beaming with pride at his conventional success. When someone finally asked about my work, I gave the shortest possible summary. The framework was being implemented, we were seeing positive results, expansion was planned for next year. My father grunted something non-committal. My mother said it sounded complicated. Daniel, trying to be supportive in his own way, said he'd read one of the articles about the funding debate and thought I'd handled the criticism well. It was the kindest thing anyone said all evening, and it came from a place of genuine care, even if he didn't really understand what I was doing. After dinner, I helped clean up, and then made an excuse about needing to get back to Washington early the next morning. My mother walked me to the door, and for a moment, I thought she might say something warm, something that acknowledged the difficulty of what I was attempting. Instead, she adjusted my coat collar and said, "Drive safely. And Rachel, don't forget that it's okay to admit when something isn't working. There's no shame in coming home." I drove back to my apartment that night fighting tears. Coming home. As if Washington wasn't home. As if the work I was doing, the life I was building, was just a temporary detour before I accepted defeat and returned to their vision of what my life should be. I called Jennifer from the road. "How was it?" she asked. "Exactly as bad as I expected. My mom basically told me I'm wasting my time and should quit before I fail." "Your mom is wrong. You know that, right?" "I know it intellectually. But it's hard when the people who are supposed to believe in you fundamentally don't. Then stop looking to them for validation. You have plenty of people who believe in you. People whose opinions actually matter because they understand what you're doing." She was right, but family wounds run deep. It wasn't about logic. It was about the little girl inside me who still wanted her parents to be proud, who still hoped that maybe this time this achievement would finally be enough. December brought the end of semester data, and it was even better than I'd hoped. All 5 pilot districts showed significant improvement in early literacy metrics. The Ohio district, which had struggled initially, posted the second highest gains after we'd helped them address their resource issues. Students were reading better, teachers reported higher confidence in their instructional methods, and principals were asking to expand the program to more grade levels. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report and presented it to Director Walsh. She read through it carefully, a smile growing on her face. "This is excellent work, Rachel. Really excellent. This is the kind of data that silences critics. Should we release it publicly?" "Absolutely. Let's schedule a press conference. Get ahead of the narrative this time instead of playing defense." The press conference happened 2 days before Christmas, held in the briefing room at the Department of Education. I stood at the podium with Director Walsh beside me, a slide presentation showing our results displayed on screens behind us. The room was full of reporters, education advocates, and even a few skeptical faces I recognized from the textbook lobby. Director Walsh introduced me and gave a brief overview of the framework, then turned the floor over to me. I walked through the data methodically, showing the baseline scores from August, the mid-semester check-ins, and the end-of-semester results. The improvements were clear and consistent. Students who'd been struggling were now reading at or near grade level. Achievement gaps were narrowing. Teachers reported that the methods were sustainable and didn't require extraordinary effort, Once they'd learned the techniques, I showed video clips of classroom implementation, brief snippets of teachers and students engaged in the literacy work. Then I opened the floor for questions. The first came from an education reporter I'd worked with before, someone who'd been fair in her coverage. "Ms. Thompson, these results are impressive. What do you say to critics who claimed the framework was failing after the preliminary data?" I'd say that educational change takes time, and judging any program after 3 months is premature. We always knew there would be implementation challenges. What matters is that we addressed those challenges and stayed committed to evidence-based practices. These results show that when the framework is implemented with fidelity and adequate support, it works. Another reporter raised his hand. "What about the cost concerns that Senator Webb and others have raised?" The cost per student is $1,200 annually, which is actually lower than many other intervention programs. More importantly, the return on investment is substantial. We're seeing students make gains that typically take 2 to 3 years of conventional instruction. That acceleration alone justifies the cost, not to mention the long-term benefits of students reading proficiently by 3rd grade. A man in the back, someone I didn't recognize, asked, "Do you have plans to expand the program?" Director Walsh stepped in. "We're currently reviewing applications from districts interested in joining the next phase. Based on these results, we're confident in expanding to an additional 20 districts next fall, with the goal of nationwide implementation within 5 years." The questions continued for another 30 minutes, most of them substantive and focused on the actual work rather than political controversy. When it ended, several reporters approached me individually, asking for follow-up interviews or additional data. I agreed to several, feeling for the first time in months that we were moving the conversation in the right direction. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive. The Washington Post ran a front-page story with the headline, "White House Education Initiative Shows Strong Results in First Semester." The New York Times education section did an in-depth feature on one of the pilot districts, interviewing teachers and showing the framework in action. Even some conservative outlets, while maintaining skepticism about federal involvement in education, acknowledged that the data was encouraging. Senator Webb's office issued a statement saying he remained concerned about long-term sustainability, but was pleased to see improvement. It was the closest thing to an admission that he'd been wrong that I was likely to get. My inbox flooded with congratulatory messages. Former colleagues, educators I'd met during site visits, advocacy groups, all reaching out to celebrate the success. Jennifer sent a bottle of champagne to my office with a note that said simply, "Told you so. Love you." Even my parents called, my mother's voice cautious but warmer than it had been at Thanksgiving. "We saw the news. It looks like things are going better." "They are, Mom. The work is proving itself." "Well, that's good. Your father says to tell you he's proud." She said it quickly, almost reluctantly, as if the words cost her something. But she said it. It wasn't the enthusiastic celebration I'd once craved, but it was acknowledgement. Maybe that was all I was going to get, and maybe that was enough. The new year brought new challenges, but they were the good kind. The challenges of scaling success rather than defending failure. We reviewed applications from districts wanting to join the program, selected the 20 most promising candidates, and began planning the training and support they'd need. I was traveling constantly again, but now I was visiting classrooms where the framework was already working, seeing students benefit, hearing teachers share their successes. In February, I received an invitation to speak at the National Education Association Conference, the largest gathering of educators in the country. It was both an honor and an opportunity to share the framework with thousands of teachers who could become advocates for its adoption in their own districts. I accepted immediately and spent weeks preparing my presentation, wanting to strike the right balance between academic rigor and practical application. The conference was in Denver, and as I flew west, I thought about how far I'd come from that studio apartment in Philadelphia, from the uncertain researcher who'd taken a chance on policy work. The keynote address was scheduled for the main ballroom, capacity 3,000 people. I'd never spoken to a crowd that large. Standing backstage, hearing the hum of conversation from the assembled educators, I felt my nerves kick in. Then I thought about Professor Harrison, about his steady belief that I could do this work. I thought about that second grader in Maryland with her pink glasses, successfully reading a passage that had once been impossible. I thought about every student who would benefit if we could just get teachers on board, if we could cut through bureaucracy and politics and actually implement what we knew worked. The introduction ended, and I walked onto the stage to sustained applause. 3,000 educators, people who dedicated their lives to teaching, welcoming me and the work I represented. I stood at the podium and began. Good morning. My name is Rachel Thompson, and 5 years ago, I was a high school guidance counselor wondering if I was making any real difference. I loved my students, but I kept seeing the same patterns. Kids arriving in 9th grade already so far behind that catching up felt impossible. Talented teachers frustrated by mandates that didn't match what research told us actually worked. A system that seemed designed to maintain itself rather than serve students. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Then I met Professor William Harrison, and he showed me that change was possible. Not easy, but possible. He'd spent decades researching evidence-based educational practices, collecting data on what actually helps students learn. And he challenged me to take that research and find a way to implement it at scale. I walked through the development of the framework, the pilot programs, the challenges and successes. I showed them data, but I also showed them video of real classrooms, real teachers, real students. I talked about the 2nd grader in Maryland and the 5th grade teacher in Ohio who told me that for the first time in her 20-year career, she felt like she had tools that actually worked for all her students, not just the ones who were easy to teach. This framework isn't magic, I said. It's not a silver bullet. It's hard work, implemented consistently, with proper support and training. But it works. And it works because it's built on what you already know as educators. It's built on respect for your professionalism and trust in your expertise. We're not here to tell you how to teach. We're here to give you tools and support to do what you've always wanted to do. Reach every student. The applause when I finished was thunderous. Educators stood, and the sound washed over me like a wave. I stood there, overwhelmed, grateful, and more certain than ever that this work mattered. The rest of the conference was a blur of conversations. Educators approaching me to ask questions, share their own experiences, express interest in bringing the framework to their districts. I collected contact information, made promises to follow up, and felt the momentum building in a way that no amount of political maneuvering could create. This was grassroots support, the kind that lasted because it came from people who'd seen results. Flying back to Washington, I drafted an email to Director Walsh outlining everything I'd heard at the conference. The enthusiasm, the questions, the potential for organic adoption beyond our official pilot program. This was how real change happened, I realized. Not just from the top down through policy mandates, but from the bottom up through teachers who believed in the work and demanded the support to do it well. March brought the announcement I'd been hoping for. The budget for the next fiscal year included full funding for the framework expansion, with an additional allocation for training and technical support. Senator Webb had tried to cut it, but moderate Republicans had joined with Democrats to preserve the funding. We'd won not through politics but through results. The work had proved itself, and that proof was undeniable. I was in my office when Director Walsh called with the news. We got everything we asked for, Rachel. Full funding, no restrictions. You did it. We did it, I corrected. This was never just me. No, but it was your framework, your vision, your determination to see it through. Give yourself credit. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, letting it sink in. Then I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the photograph of Professor Harrison I'd kept there, the one from his office at Temple. We did it, I said to the image. It's really happening. That evening Jennifer called. I saw the budget news. Congratulations don't seem big enough. Thank you for everything. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For being there through all of it. That's what friends do. And Rachel, your parents were wrong. You didn't fail. You succeeded beyond what anyone could have predicted. I hope you're letting yourself feel that. I was trying to. Years of conditioning don't dissolve overnight, but I was learning to recognize my own achievements, to internalize success the way I'd always internalized doubt. The framework was going to reach hundreds of thousands of students. I'd helped create something that would outlast my time in this position, that would continue helping kids long after I moved on to whatever came next. That weekend, I drove to Laurel Hill Cemetery. I hadn't been since my first month in Washington, and I felt the need to tell Professor Harrison about everything that had happened. The spring morning was cool and bright, the cemetery peaceful. I found his grave and sat down on the grass beside it, not caring about the dampness. We got full funding, I told him. The framework is expanding to 20 districts next year, with plans for nationwide implementation. Educators are asking for it not because we're mandating it but because they've seen it work. It's everything you hoped for. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of new growth. I wish you were here to see it. I wish I could tell you in person, hear you say you're proud. But I think you knew this would happen. You left me the framework because you knew I'd fight for it, that I wouldn't give up even when it got hard. Thank you for that. Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself. I stayed there for a long time, just sitting in the quiet, feeling connected to something larger than myself. The work wasn't about me, wasn't about proving my parents wrong or achieving some personal vindication. It was about students, about giving them the education they deserved, about honoring the legacy of a teacher who'd spent his life trying to make the system better. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter than I had in months. The path forward was clear. Keep implementing, keep refining, keep fighting for every student who'd been told they couldn't learn, who'd been failed by a system that didn't believe in them. 2 years after that budget victory, I stood in the Rose Garden at the White House, surrounded by educators, policymakers, and students whose lives had been changed by the framework. The president was about to sign an executive order making the National Education Innovation Framework the standard for federal education funding, requiring districts that received federal money to implement evidence-based practices aligned with our research. It was a culmination of everything we'd worked toward. A moment of triumph that felt both surreal and inevitable. The president spoke about the importance of education, about investing in our children's futures, about the courage it took to challenge entrenched systems. Then he called me forward. Rachel Thompson started this work as a researcher with a vision and the determination to make it real. Against skepticism, against political opposition, against people who said it couldn't be done, she proved that evidence-based education reform works. Rachel, would you like to say a few words? I hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't expected to be called on. But I stepped to the microphone, looking out at the gathered crowd, and spoke from the heart. Thank you, Mr. President. This moment belongs to so many people. To Professor William Harrison, who built the foundation. To the teachers who trusted the methods and implemented them with dedication. To the students who showed us what's possible when we give them the tools they need. And to everyone who believed that education could be better, should be better, and refused to accept that our children deserved anything less than our best effort. I paused, my voice catching slightly. 5 years ago, I was told I'd never amount to anything. That I was chasing fantasies, that I should be realistic, that my dreams were too big and too impractical. I'm standing here today not to prove those voices wrong, but to prove that belief in evidence, commitment to excellence, and refusal to accept failure are the only dreams worth chasing. Every child deserves an education built on what works, not on what's convenient or profitable. That's what this framework represents, and that's what we'll continue fighting for. The applause was warm and sustained. The president signed the order, handed me the pen, and shook my hand. Cameras flashed, capturing a moment that would appear in news coverage that evening, in education journals, in the record of what we'd accomplished. Afterward, there was a reception in the East Room. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, sharing credit, thanking everyone who'd contributed to the success. Director Walsh found me near the windows overlooking the garden. How does it feel? She asked. Overwhelming. Incredible. Like I might wake up and discover it was all a dream. It's real. You made it real. And Rachel, I want you to know that when my term ends next year, I'm recommending you as my replacement. You've earned it. I stared at her, stunned. Director of the Department of Education. It was a position I'd never imagined for myself, a level of responsibility and influence that seemed impossibly large. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. You don't have to decide now, but I wanted you to know that I believe you're ready. That night, back in my apartment, I called Jennifer. The president signed the order. It's official. I watched it live. You were amazing. How do you feel? Grateful. Exhausted. Vindicated in a way I probably shouldn't need but definitely do. Your parents must be losing their minds. I laughed. They sent flowers. My mother called and said she was proud. She actually sounded like she meant it this time. Character growth. Only took her 5 years. We talked for another hour, processing everything, marveling at the journey. When we finally hung up, I sat on my couch looking at the framed photograph of Professor Harrison I'd brought home from my office. We did it, I told him again. Your framework is now national policy. Students across the country are going to benefit from your life's work. I hope wherever you are, you know that your legacy is secure. The next morning I woke to dozens of messages. News coverage, interview requests, congratulations from colleagues and former students. But the message that mattered most was from a teacher in Ohio, from the district that had struggled initially but had turned around so dramatically. She'd attached a photo of her classroom, students engaged in a literacy activity, their faces focused and confident. The message read, "Thank you for not giving up on us. These kids are reading, learning, believing in themselves. You changed their lives. You changed mine too." I saved that message, printed the photo, and added it to the wall in my office alongside the other reminders of why this work mattered. Because it wasn't about the White House or the national recognition or proving skeptics wrong. It was about that classroom in Ohio, about students who now had a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise, about teachers who finally had the tools they needed. 3 months later, I accepted the nomination to become director of the Department of Education. The confirmation hearing was smooth, my record of success speaking for itself. Even Senator Webb, still a member of the committee, voted in favor, acknowledging in his questioning that the framework had exceeded his initial expectations. I was confirmed unanimously, a rare achievement in the polarized political environment. My parents came to Washington for the swearing-in ceremony. It was the first time they'd visited since I'd moved to the city 4 years earlier. My mother looked around the office that would be mine, at the portraits of former education secretaries, at the evidence of the institution I was about to lead, and for the first time in my memory, she seemed genuinely impressed. "This is quite an office, Rachel." "It is. You've done well for yourself. Better than we imagined." It wasn't exactly the apology I might have wanted, but it was acknowledgement. She'd underestimated me, and now she was confronting that reality. I chose to take it as growth however late it came. My father, quieter as always, put his hand on my shoulder. "Your professor would be proud. I wish he could have seen this." "Me too, Dad." The ceremony itself was brief and formal, the vice president administering the oath while my family and close friends watched. When it was done, when I was officially the director of the Department of Education, I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders. This was real responsibility, the kind that affected millions of students, that shaped the future of American education. But I also felt ready. The years of struggle, of proving myself, of fighting for the framework against opposition and doubt, had prepared me for exactly this. I knew how to navigate resistance, how to build coalitions, how to stay focused on mission when politics tried to distract. Most importantly, I knew that education policy wasn't abstract theory. It was that second grader in Maryland, that classroom in Ohio, that teacher who finally had tools that worked. As long as I kept that at the center of every decision, I'd make choices I could defend. The reception after the ceremony was held at a nearby hotel. Daniel and Amanda were there with their kids, my niece and nephew now old enough to understand that their aunt had just been given an important job. My nephew, aged 10, asked what exactly I'd be in charge of. "I help make decisions about schools," I told him. "About what teachers teach and how they teach it. About making sure every student gets a good education." "That's cool. Are you like the principal of the whole country?" I smiled. "Something like that. My teacher says you made our reading program better. She says more kids are learning to read now because of what you did." Out of everything that had happened that day, that simple statement from a 10-year-old meant the most. Because he was right. More kids were learning to read. The framework was working. The years of effort had produced tangible, measurable improvements in children's lives. Everything else, the titles and recognition and vindication, were secondary to that fundamental success. As the reception wound down, I found a quiet moment near the windows overlooking the city. Jennifer appeared beside me with 2 glasses of champagne. "To the Director of Education," she said, raising her glass. "To the people who believed when it mattered," I countered, touching my glass to hers. "Rachel, Do you remember that night after your parents' Thanksgiving disaster? When you called me from your car crying, convinced that maybe they were right and you'd made a terrible mistake? I remember. Look at where you are now. Look at what you've accomplished. You were never the dreamer they tried to make you believe you were. You were a visionary, and there's a massive difference. I hugged her, grateful beyond words for her friendship, for her unwavering support through all of it. She'd been there for every setback and every victory, celebrating the wins and softening the losses. That kind of friendship was worth more than any professional achievement. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to send, but to save a record of this moment and how it felt. I wrote about the journey from that Philadelphia studio to this position, about Professor Harrison's framework becoming national policy, about proving that evidence and commitment could overcome doubt and resistance. I wrote about my parents, about the complicated feelings of wanting their approval while knowing I didn't need it, about finally receiving acknowledgement even if it came late and grudgingly. I wrote about the students, the real reason any of this mattered, about the responsibility I now carried to make decisions that would affect their education and their futures. When I finished, I sealed the letter in an envelope and tucked it into my desk drawer. Someday, when this chapter of my life was over, I'd open it again and remember how this felt. The magnitude, the gratitude, the determination to use this opportunity well. The work began immediately. There was no grace period, no time to bask in achievement. There were budget meetings and policy reviews and a dozen crises requiring immediate attention. But I was ready for it, energized by it even. This was what I'd been preparing for through all those years of research and implementation and advocacy. Now I had the platform to create change at the largest possible scale, and I wasn't going to waste it. 6 months into my tenure as director, I returned to Scranton for the first time since taking the position. The local high school had invited me to speak at their graduation, and I'd accepted, wanting to return to my roots, to speak to students who came from the same kind of working class background I did. Standing at the podium in the school gymnasium, looking out at the graduating seniors in their caps and gowns, I saw myself at that age. Uncertain about the future, hungry for something more than what my immediate world offered, not yet knowing what I was capable of achieving. 15 years ago, I sat where you're sitting. I began. I was graduating from this school, heading to Temple University, and people in my life were already telling me to be realistic, to lower my expectations, to accept that big dreams were for other people. I want to tell you something important. Those people were wrong. Not because they were mean or didn't care about me, but because they couldn't imagine possibilities beyond their own experience. Your dreams don't have to fit into someone else's understanding of what's realistic. I talked about my journey, about Professor Harrison, about the framework and the struggle to implement it, about the moment the White House called. I'm not standing here to tell you that success is easy or that belief alone is enough. It's not. Success requires work, dedication, resilience, and yes, some luck. But it starts with refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. It starts with believing that evidence matters, that effort counts, that the world can change if enough people commit to changing it. The applause when I finished was enthusiastic, and afterward, several students approached me with questions. A young woman, valedictorian, heading to Penn State in the fall, asked how I dealt with doubt. I learned to separate useful criticism from destructive doubt, I told her. Useful criticism helps you improve. Destructive doubt just tells you to give up. Learn to recognize the difference and only listen to the first kind. A young man, clearly uncertain about his path, asked what advice I'd give someone who didn't know what they wanted to do yet. Don't pressure yourself to have it all figured out. I didn't know I'd end up in education policy when I graduated. I just knew I cared about helping students, and I followed that thread wherever it led. Trust that if you move toward what matters to you, the specific path will reveal itself. My parents were in the audience, and afterward we went to dinner at a local restaurant. The conversation was easier than it had been in years, my mother actually asking about my work with genuine interest rather than skeptical concern. She even admitted carefully that she'd been wrong to doubt me. I thought I was protecting you, she said. I didn't want you to be disappointed. I'd seen so many people reach for things they couldn't achieve and get hurt in the process. I know, Mom. But I wasn't one of those people. I had the capability, I had the work ethic, and I had the vision. What I needed was support, not protection from potential failure. She nodded, not quite apologizing but acknowledging the truth of what I said. It was enough. We'd never have a perfect relationship, but we were finding a workable one, and that was its own kind of success. Driving back to Washington the next day, I felt a sense of completion. The circle had closed. I'd returned to where I started, but everything was different. I was different. The doubt and insecurity that had once defined me had been replaced by confidence earned through achievement. I knew what I was capable of now, knew that my vision and determination could create real change. The framework continued expanding, reaching more districts, more students, more teachers every year. The data kept confirming what we'd always believed. Evidence-based practices worked. Students were learning better, achieving more, preparing for futures that might have been closed to them under the old system. And I was there, at the center of it, shaping policy and defending progress and fighting for every child who deserved better than what the system had been giving them. 5 years after that graduation speech in Scranton, I stood at another podium, this time at an international education conference in Geneva. The framework had expanded beyond the United States, adapted and implemented in schools across 3 continents. What had started as Professor Harrison's research, refined in my Philadelphia apartment and tested in 5 pilot districts, had become a global movement. Educational excellence is not a luxury for privileged students, I said to the assembled delegates from 40 countries. It's a fundamental right for every child, regardless of where they're born or what circumstances they're born into. The framework proves that with the right methods, proper support, and unwavering commitment, we can close achievement gaps and give every student the tools they need to succeed. This is not idealistic fantasy. This is documented, reproducible, evidence-based success. And it's available to anyone willing to do the work. The applause echoed through the hall, and I stood there feeling the full weight and wonder of how far we'd come. From that moment in my parents' living room when I'd been told I'd never amount to anything, to this moment representing American education on a global stage, the journey had been longer and harder than I could have imagined. But it had also been more rewarding, more meaningful, more transformative than I'd dared to hope. That night, I video called Jennifer from my hotel room. She appeared on screen in her own office, still at work despite the late hour. How did the speech go? Good. Really good. I think we're going to see several countries adopt modified versions of the framework. That's incredible. Professor Harrison's work is literally changing global education. And Rachel, it's your work too. You took his research and made it real. You fought for it when no one else would have. I had help. I had you, I had Director Walsh, I had teachers willing to try something new. Yes, but you were the one who refused to give up. When the early data was bad, when the critics attacked, when it would have been easier to walk away, you stayed. That's why this succeeded. Because you believed in it enough to see it through. After we hung up, I thought about belief, about how it could be both a burden and a gift. My parents' lack of belief had wounded me, but it had also made me self-sufficient, had taught me to find validation internally rather than seeking it externally. Professor Harrison's belief had given me direction and courage, had shown me what was possible when someone saw your potential clearly. And my own belief, hard-won and repeatedly tested, had carried me through every obstacle to this moment. I opened my laptop and pulled up a folder I'd kept throughout the journey. Photos from classrooms, emails from teachers, data showing student improvement, letters from parents whose children had learned to read because of the framework. This was what belief had built. Not just a career or a reputation, but actual change in actual lives. That was the measure that mattered, the only validation I really needed. The next morning, I visited Professor Harrison's grave one final time before my flight home. It was a small cemetery outside the city, quiet and green, overlooking rolling hills. I brought flowers and stood at his marker for a long time, just being present, feeling grateful. It worked, I told him. Everything you dreamed of, everything you worked toward, it's happening. Students around the world are benefiting from your life's work. And I got to be part of making that real. Thank you for trusting me with it. Thank you for believing in me when I needed it most. I hope I've honored your legacy. I hope I've built something that will last. The wind carried my words away, and I stood there in the peaceful morning, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The journey wasn't over. There was always more work to do, more students to reach, more systems to improve. But I'd proved what needed proving, to myself and to everyone who doubted. I'd taken a vision and made it reality. I'd taken criticism and turned it into motivation. I'd taken doubt and transformed it into determination. And most importantly, I'd taken one professor's dream and spread it across the world, giving countless students opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. That was legacy. That was success. That was what it meant to amount to something. The years that followed brought a rhythm to my work that felt both demanding and deeply satisfying. I settled into the role of director with a clarity of purpose that guided every decision, every policy discussion, every budget negotiation. The framework continued its expansion, now implemented in over 2,000 districts across the United States, reaching millions of students. International delegations visited regularly, seeking guidance on adapting the methods for their own educational systems. What had once been a controversial experiment was now established policy, its effectiveness proven beyond reasonable doubt. My relationship with my parents evolved into something more comfortable, if never quite warm. They called more frequently now, asking about my work with what seemed like genuine interest rather than skeptical concern. My mother even mentioned me to her friends, a shift I noticed during a rare visit home when I overheard her talking about her daughter who worked in education at a national level. It wasn't the enthusiastic pride I might have wanted as a child, but it was acknowledgement, and I'd learned to accept that as enough. Daniel and I grew closer during this period as well. He'd left his pharmaceutical sales job to start his own consulting business, and the uncertainty of entrepreneurship gave him a new perspective on risk-taking and unconventional paths. We had dinner whenever I was in the Philadelphia area, and our conversations became more substantive, more honest. He admitted once that he'd envied my courage to pursue something meaningful rather than just financially secure, that watching my success had prompted him to reconsider his own choices. The work itself continued to challenge and fulfill me in equal measure. Budget fights remained constant, as they always are in government. New administrations brought new priorities, and I learned to navigate political shifts while protecting the core of what we'd built. The framework's results made it difficult for anyone to completely dismantle, even when political winds shifted. Evidence had a power that transcended partisan divisions, and we'd accumulated enough evidence to weather most storms. I continued traveling to schools, insisting on maintaining direct contact with the teachers and students the policies affected. It would have been easy to become isolated in Washington, surrounded by policy discussions and political calculations, losing touch with the actual work happening in classrooms. But I'd learned from Professor Harrison that real educational leadership required staying connected to the ground level, understanding implementation challenges firsthand, and listening to the people doing the hardest work. During one visit to an elementary school in rural Kentucky, a third-grade teacher pulled me aside after I'd observed her literacy lesson. She was young, probably in her first few years of teaching, and she looked nervous about speaking to me. "I just wanted to thank you," she said quietly. "I grew up in this district. I was one of those kids who struggled to read, who almost dropped out in high school because I was so far behind. If this framework had existed when I was in school, my whole life might have been different. Now I get to make sure my students don't go through what I did. That means everything to me." I felt tears sting my eyes and had to take a moment before responding. "Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for doing this work. Teachers like you are why the framework succeeds. The policy is just paper until people like you bring it to life in classrooms." That conversation stayed with me for months afterward, a reminder of why persistence through difficulty mattered, why fighting through opposition and doubt served a purpose larger than personal vindication. Jennifer remained my closest friend and most trusted confidant throughout everything. She'd eventually moved to Washington as well, taking a position with an education advocacy nonprofit, and we saw each other regularly for dinners that turned into therapy sessions where we processed the complexities of working in a field we cared deeply about while navigating bureaucratic and political realities. She married during my 5th year as director, and I stood beside her as maid of honor, grateful to celebrate her happiness after she'd supported me through so many challenges. At the reception, she pulled me aside between dances. "You know what I'm most proud of about you?" she asked. "It's not the awards or the position or any of that external stuff. It's that you stayed yourself through all of it. You didn't let the work harden you or make you cynical. You still care as much as you did when we first met, when you were just a researcher with a vision." Her words meant more than she probably realized, because staying connected to the original purpose, while operating at high levels of responsibility, required constant conscious effort. It would have been easy to become someone who cared more about political wins than student outcomes, who measured success in policy victories rather than literacy rates. The administrative machinery could swallow you if you weren't careful, turning you into someone who served the system rather than the mission. I thought about that danger often, checking myself against it, making sure I remembered why this work mattered. 10 years after becoming director, I received word that I was being considered for the National Humanities Medal, an honor recognizing contributions to American culture and education. The selection process was lengthy and opaque, but when the official notification arrived, I felt a sense of completion that was different from any previous achievement. This wasn't about proving competence or defending against criticism. This was recognition that the work had made a lasting contribution, that it would be remembered and built upon by future generations. The ceremony was held at the White House, a different administration than the one that had first appointed me, but the framework had survived the transition, evidence of its bipartisan value. Standing in the East Room waiting for my name to be called, I thought about the journey that had led here. The small apartment in Philadelphia where I'd first read Professor Harrison's framework. The cabin visits to struggling districts. The contentious hearings and critical news coverage. The moment when early data suggested failure, and I'd had to choose between backing down and pushing forward. Every challenge had been necessary, I realized. Every obstacle had taught me something essential about leadership, about resilience, about the difference between stubbornness and commitment. If the path had been easy, if everyone had believed in the framework immediately, I wouldn't have developed the skills needed to protect and expand it through the inevitable difficulties that came later. The president called my name, and I walked forward to receive the medal. The citation read aloud spoke of transforming American education, of evidence-based policymaking, of leadership that prioritized student outcomes above political expediency. It was generous and overwhelming, and I accepted it with gratitude while mentally dedicating it to Professor Harrison, to the teachers implementing the framework daily, to the students whose improved outcomes justified everything. In my brief acceptance remarks, I said what I believed most deeply. This recognition belongs to everyone who believed that education could be better and refused to accept that our children deserved anything less than our most thoughtful, evidence-based efforts. To the teachers who trusted unfamiliar methods because research supported them. To the students who showed us what's possible when we give them proper tools. To the mentor who taught me that vision without evidence is just dreaming, but evidence without vision changes nothing. This medal represents all of you. The reception afterward felt like a reunion of everyone who'd been part of the journey. Former colleagues, district administrators I'd worked with, teachers who'd been early adopters of the framework, all gathered to celebrate not just my recognition but the collective achievement we'd built together. Director Walsh, now retired but still engaged in education advocacy, approached me with tears in her eyes. I knew from that first presentation you gave that you were special, but even I didn't imagine this. You've changed the trajectory of American education. That's not hyperbole. That's measurable fact. I hugged her, grateful for her early faith and continued support. You gave me the platform. You defended the work when it would have been easier to cut losses and move on. None of this happens without you. She shook her head. Leaders create opportunities. You seized the opportunity and built something extraordinary. There's a difference. Later that evening, back in my apartment, I sat with the medal in its presentation box and let myself fully feel the magnitude of what had been accomplished. It wasn't just my achievement. That was crucial to remember. But I had been the catalyst, the persistent force that kept the framework alive through challenges that could have killed it. I'd learned to trust my own judgment while remaining open to correction. I'd learned to fight for what mattered while being flexible about how to achieve it. I'd learned that validation from people who understand your work means everything, while validation from people determined to misunderstand you means nothing. Most importantly, I'd learned that my parents' doubt had said more about their limitations than mine, and that building a life they couldn't imagine didn't make me wrong. It made me someone willing to envision possibilities beyond inherited assumptions. My mother called the next day, having seen news coverage of the ceremony. That's quite an honor, Rachel. Your father and I watched the video. You looked very professional. Professional. It was such a careful word. chosen to acknowledge achievement without expressing full-throated pride. But I'd stopped needing that from her years ago. Thanks, Mom. It was a wonderful evening. We always knew you were smart. We just worried you were too idealistic for your own good. There it was. Even in congratulation, the echo of old doubts. But I could hear it now for what it was, her attempt to reconcile her previous predictions with current reality. She'd been wrong, and admitting that directly was harder than suggesting she'd always known while simultaneously expressing concern. I let it go. Some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you'd already won the war that mattered. The framework continued evolving, adapting to new research, incorporating feedback from thousands of implementation sites. What had started as Professor Harrison's vision had become something larger, a living system that improved through use, that grew more effective as more educators contributed insights and refinements. That collaborative evolution was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the work. It wasn't static policy handed down from above. It was dynamic practice emerging from the intersection of research and real-world application. 5 years after receiving the Humanities Medal, I stepped down as director. 15 years in the position was enough. I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do, and the framework was secure, embedded in educational systems too deeply to be easily uprooted. It was time for new leadership with fresh vision to take the work forward, while I moved into a different role. I accepted a position at Stanford, creating and directing a new Center for Evidence-Based Education Policy. The work would be different, more research-focused, more concentrated on training the next generation of education leaders. But it felt like a natural progression, a way to multiply impact by developing others who would carry the mission forward in ways I couldn't predict or control. Jennifer helped me pack up my Washington apartment, the two of us surrounded by boxes containing 15 years of accumulated life. Any regrets? She asked, wrapping picture frames in newspaper. About leaving? None. I stayed exactly as long as I should have. Any longer and I'd start repeating myself instead of innovating. I'm going to miss having you in the same city. Stanford's not that far. And you'll visit. We'll make it work. She smiled. We always do. The move to California felt like both an ending and a beginning. I found a small house near campus, nothing fancy but comfortable, with a study where I could work and a garden where I could think. The center opened with funding from multiple foundations, attracted excellent faculty, and immediately drew strong applicants for its graduate programs. Students who wanted to change education the way I had, who believed in evidence and equity and the power of well-designed systems to improve lives. Teaching them felt like paying forward what Professor Harrison had given me, the gift of someone believing in your potential and providing the tools to realize it. On the first day of my seminar on education policy implementation, I stood before 20 graduate students and began with a question. Who here has been told by someone they respect that their educational vision is unrealistic? More than half the hands went up. I smiled. Good. That means you're thinking big enough. If everyone immediately agrees with your ideas, you're probably not proposing anything that will create real change. The question isn't whether you'll face doubt. The question is whether you'll let that doubt stop you or use it as motivation to prove your evidence. I told them about the framework, about the early failures and the criticism and the moment I'd had to choose between giving up and pushing through. I told them about Professor Harrison and the legacy he'd entrusted to me. I told them the truth about how hard the work would be and how much it would matter. Educational change is slow, I said. It requires patience, persistence, and faith that evidence will eventually overcome inertia. But it's possible. It's real. And it's the most important work you can do, because it shapes every other possibility in society. Education is infrastructure for human potential. When we improve it, we improve everything. Their faces showed the mix of excitement and intimidation I remembered feeling at their age, the sense of standing at the beginning of something vast and uncertain. I felt honored to guide them, to share what I'd learned, to help them avoid some mistakes while understanding that they'd need to make others to grow. The work continued, taking new forms but serving the same essential purpose, giving students everywhere a better chance at the education they deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.